Human culture thrives when discussions about what is true, what is just, and what is beautiful is remembered as an ongoing, never-ending, never-complete conversation.
To quote Milton, by the known rules of ancient liberty, welcome to Risky Conversations. I am your co-host, Shadab. Join me and my co-host, Ace Deliri, as we engage in this ancient tradition of discussions around interesting topics with utterly fascinating people.
Welcome to Risky Conversations, Niloofar. Please introduce yourself to our listeners.
Hi, Ace. Thanks for having me. My name is Niloofar. You can call me Nilo if you want. I'm a PhD student in systems engineering at Virginia Tech. I got my master's in model-based systems engineering from University of Maryland at College Park. I got my bachelor's in aerospace engineering in Sharif University of Technology back in Iran. So it's been 5 years that I'm in the United States. I also worked for aviation industry for a few years. So as a system analyst. So I guess, yeah, that's all.
Oh, well, that's quite the career path in terms of where you started and where you're going now. So what is your PhD going to be in?
Well, I mostly work on the theory of systems engineering. I don't know if you're aware of it, but systems engineering has been recently introduced as an individual discipline, right? So before, it was kind of a combination of some kind of best practices and heuristics that different experts in different fields had based on their try and errors working with complex systems. So it was kind of a combination of best practices. But then systems engineering community realized that we really need more rigorous and solid foundation for systems engineering. So we need to introduce a domain specifically concerned with the finding the theory and application of appropriate strategies in making complex systems. So that's what we call the theory of systems engineering. So I mostly work on this area as my PhD, research. So this is divided into different subfields. So we can work on problem formulation, we can work on system architecture, we can work on verification and validation part.
Well, that's pretty cool. So let's just start with the basics for our listeners who may not be very well versed with their field. What exactly is a system? How do you define it in your scientific notation?
Well, there are lots of different, definitions that different organizations provide. But the one that I think it's really necessary for everyone to know is that system is basically a combination of interrelated and interdependent components that can work together in order to achieve specific functionality in their operating environment. So it's completely based on their context. Sometimes they show synergy or immersion behavior or adaptive behaviors, but sometimes are simply interconnecting with each other to achieve a common goal. And in terms of, in a more rigorous terms, you can define system as an entity with specific boundaries in space and time, right? And it can get a set of possible inputs, have its own internal processes, and provide, a set of outputs. based on its context. So that's a basic of definition of system.
Okay. So when I hear you speak, my mind goes in three different places. So help me delineate the difference between a system, like for example, the human body is. So if you look at it, it's got to be sort of a system, right? Because things are trying to keep you alive, other things are trying to keep you dead. There's energy being used, there's energy being consumed. There's repairs being done, there's damage being done. All that stuff. There's also the economy, which is the entire planet interconnected, going about their business. People are fraudsters, people are running Ponzi schemes, other people are producing stuff. And then there's mechanical systems like a car. So you have a car where you can, to a certain degree, predict what's going to happen in a car much easier than you could with a human body or a economy. So when you're looking at these differences, what in your mind helps you distinguish between a car, an economy, or a body? Because technically they could all be labeled as systems, no?
So first of all, we should understand that there's no such thing as system out there, right? So it's kind of a conceptual entity that we created just in order to, deal with the complexity of the real world, right? So it's not like you cannot objectively define a system like I have a car. It is a system. It's a wrong approach to defining a system. We have a real world, and as you said, everything is connected. Everything is interdependent. Some of the systems are very complex, like climate change, like a weather system. How do you want to define a boundary for this system? It's not objective, right? You can consider so many factors that can affect into the final outcome of some phenomena, right? So it depends on how you want to deal with the complexity, how the immediate constraints and limitations allow you to, extend the boundaries, consider more variables, more factors in your systems. We have different, limitations, computation tools, and even our thinking capabilities, right? So this is one specific information that we need to keep in our mind. And then when we're talking about systems engineering, of course, the traditional terms of systems engineering is traced back to World War II, when we actually realized that we need kind of a holistic view of engineering systems when we faced so many failures in using different tools and equipments during World War II. So that's why systems engineering as a new paradigm emerged. But so
before you go on, just can you help us understand when you say, so we had an initial conversation about systems, so now we're going to transition over to systems engineering. So the idea of systems engineering is different from a system in the regard that it's an area of study that you can actually sort of somewhat pigeonhole and study and measure the input and output. Is that where the engineering aspect of it comes in, or is that just still me reaching for various branches that are not there?
Well, systems engineering was born out of system philosophy, systems theory, right? So we had these concepts and principles for general systems. And of course, we have like different categories of systems: organic, suborganic, superorganic systems. But in general, we have some sets of, definitions for system. And at some point, we realized that we need to use these kind of principles when we are trying to add a new kind of system into our context, the one that was not had not been invented before. So the traditional term of systems engineering is exactly what you said. So we wanted to, build these kind of engineering systems to achieve some types of goal in our context. And then we use like different practices for this, different methodologies. How do we deal with the complexities? How do we approach the systems thinking? We'll leverage systems thinking in this process. So this is types of systems engineering, traditional systems engineering approach, which was specifically defined for engineering systems, like aerospace systems, defense systems, civil infrastructure systems, and things like that. But as the emerging complexities in different systems show in the real world, then the definition of systems engineering has evolved. For example, now we can engineer a political agreement, right? Or we can engineer, we can use systems engineering approach to deal with the complexity of a system like an economic, like a stock market, or working with societies dealing with human-centered systems. So it all depends on the context you are working on. So the new definition of systems engineering is not limited to engineering systems. It's about how you can leverage these methodologies, these philosophies to different types of systems. And it's way beyond the engineering world.
I see. So when I hear all this, my mind first gravitates toward it. So if somebody's listening to you right now, their main question may be, why should I study systems engineering? What kind of real world applications to this concept are there? Is this just a theoretical area of study for people who are interested in math and they're looking at nonlinear systems that are all around us, or is this something that you can actually take and you can say, okay, I can take so I'll give you an example. So if you study business, for example, if you study finance, you can get a job virtually in any business, even a nonprofit, because they have to know how to manage their finances, right? So it's a very broad general idea that you can apply every which way you go. So if you study systems engineering the way you're describing it here, where is the insight that it's going to lend itself so you can apply it in multiple domains? Or is it just a narrow band and I'm giving it more leeway than it actually fairly wants on its own?
Right. So when you're dealing with different systems, there are different sources of complexities, uncertainties, and risks associated with that system. For example, when you are dealing with a very large scale engineering system, right? You might have to deal with different types of disciplines. You have control engineers, you have software engineers, you have user interface designers, and things like that. The interactions between these organizations and these teams, sub-teams, in order to achieve a common goal, is kind of one of the sources of this complexity. How do you manage these interfaces, like these different types of interfaces? How do you make sure that their specific solution space and design space is aligned with the higher level of system goal? How do you want to deal with that? Of course, when you have just a team of control engineers and a team of software engineers and a team of hardware engineers, they are best at their own fields of expertise, so they can provide the most efficient, for example, control system for their own purpose. But how do you fit this subsystem into a bigger entity and make sure that this subsystem is still aligned with the entire, functionality and entire purpose of the system. It's a very big challenge. And on the other hand, when you're dealing with, for example, different types of data, the logic behind data, the information that you can get from this data, the huge amount of variables that you need to take into consideration. Look at this pandemic. Like, there are lots of, at first there was no data, no information, and people were saying that, okay, we don't have enough information, so we think that we are overreacting. And now we have lots of data, lots of information from different places in the world, but still we cannot kind of appropriately manage the noise and the differences between perfect information and incomplete information with the noise. It's a very big challenge that adds to the complexity of your system. And all of these are just one aspect of the complexity when you are dealing with systems. The nature of the systems are also very complex. For example, when you are dealing with kind of systems and you want to analyze the behavior of the system or the structure of the system, you have you can assume that the system can get a set of inputs, but there are some times that you don't have enough information about all possible inputs that the system can get. Or even if you can understand all the possible inputs that the system can get, you cannot, either by computational limitations or by just unknown unknowns or known unknowns, known unknown knowledge, you cannot grasp the possible set of outputs. So it's the nature of nonlinear responses from this system really asks for a higher level of understanding of the system. First of all, in order to catch all these invalid assumptions, how to tailor your problem formulation, how you make sure that this specific solution space is a right solution for the right problem, and at some point when you don't have enough information, then how you're going to deal with these uncertainties, how you take risks regarding these uncertainty and lack of knowledge and ignorance that you have. So systems engineers basically try to address these high-level aspect of engineering systems, and that's really interesting because it's one of the very few disciplines that it was used in real world for so long, and then we really thought that, okay, we need to think about it in a more rigorous way, to think about possible strategies to deal with these kind of complexities. So it's kind of difference from the traditional disciplines, that they drive some mathematical theories, drive some principles, and then they want to apply to the real world. In systems engineering, the process is completely in different direction. You see this real world problem and you want to make sure that there are some strategies to deal with these problems. So it's kind of, I'm not saying that it's kind of backward engineering. It's not. It's just finding principles that you can deal with with these problems, in a especially higher scale of system development and system design and problem formulation? Well, it really depends on your problem. That's a very, very important problem to deal with. When you are, well, there's a dilemma here. When we don't have enough information, you cannot, completely, understand the system and analyze the system behaviors. And on the other hand, when you have lots of information, then how do you want to verify this amount of information? How do you want to, you know, deal with the noises, with coming with this amount of information? But of course, there are things that you can do about it. For example, understanding the causation, like the underlying causes of this data. What are the specific scenarios that led to this data, to this information? How the limitations and constraints, different constraints, had some kind of impacts on your data. So it's not like just having data and doing some statistical analysis and make decisions on your system behaviors and system structure. It's about understanding the causation. It's about finding the correct words to describe the problem in the first place. So, for example, if you have a problem, I'm gonna provide a very stupid example, but for example, if you have a problem, like you need a car, you need to buy a car. Is this your real problem? Is this your real need? Or is this derived by some other needs? For example, more than a car, you need self-confidence, something like that, So it's kind of understanding the roots of the problems, how to formulate your problems, and how to order decision criteria based on that problem. These are the ways that you can possibly avoid from noises and unrelated information. Like when you can provide a solid framework for your system, then it's easier for you to just omit unrelated and inappropriate information coming in your way.
Okay, so let's go from the theoretical to some of the more practical approaches to it. So give me an example of a system that you could look at right now. Like, for example, I imagine the response to the pandemic is sort of like a systems level problem, right? So you have people who believe that this thing is a hoax and there's nothing really a big deal about it. And there are other people saying this is actually quite dangerous, so we need to address it. And then so you have multiple layers, because you have the political layer, then you have the financial layer, because a lot of the poorer countries may not have the money to have all their entire population take time off while they try to isolate everybody and handle the income loss that comes with it. Then you have the actual hospitals that are getting overwhelmed. Then you have the suppliers that are bringing the equipment into the hospital to help treat the issues. So there's multiple layers of that. So is that like that must seem like a dream scenario for somebody like you, because you can study at that particular issue at multiple layers, no?
Yeah, exactly. It's at the same time very interesting topic to just look at as a systems engineer, and at the same time it's very sad, especially given the fact that when I go back and when I look back in retrospect and saw that think about all these things happening in early January. All these crazy stuff happened in Wuhan, and there were really very few people who actually raise the question of this being a pandemic, or the possibility of this being a pandemic is not insignificant. And then at the same time, you see that the emerging patterns of individual behaviors as well as like collective behaviors as we go through this crisis. It's really interesting for me. Of course, it raises so many questions on my mind that, to be honest with you, I have no solid answer to right now. For example, how these actions were derived. How do you make sure that all these actions from President Trump are not derived from the fact that the election is coming? So how many of these actions are derived from purely economic drivers? How many of these actions are derived from purely moral frameworks and ethical frameworks? And again, we are witnessing the vagueness of the framing of this problem. For example, in some countries, you can see that they don't do anything. At least for in Iran, that I have some first-hand information from my relatives and friends there. Basically, the government doesn't do anything effectively against the spread of this virus, and sometimes you don't know what the logic behind these decisions are, or the lack of decisions are. Are they really trying to just get rid of some percentage of their population? Or do they think about purely economic gains? Or they're still, they are still entitled to moral issues? So when in this term, when you lack a clear framework for your decisions, then you can witness a lot of noises coming from different analysis, because they don't have the baseline, the mutual baseline. They don't have the mutual, goal, right? And this is very, very hard to grasp. And as you see that the more you are in this crisis, the harder you can get out of it. And also, if you get out of it, the more the crisis continues, the harder you can get back to the normal life. In some point, when you're dealing with I guess that in terms of individual behaviors, like we can say like agent behaviors, you can see that still, at least it's my observation. I don't want to generalize my observation, but at least what I've witnessed is that there are still lots of people who have not taken this pandemic seriously enough. For example, last week I was in a grocery store and nobody wore masks except me and a few Asian guys. So maybe, and we can witness that the real correlation between the amount of information that you get from the problem and the respected the appropriate behavior that you have against this problem. So for example, I would assume that those Asian guys are wearing masks because they actually witnessed what was happening in Wuhan and in China in general firsthand. I wore a mask because I got the information from different outlets, and I was following the news since early January, right? So at some point, these individual levels will uh, contribute to the emergence of a collective level of panic, I would say, because I really don't think that, right now we have witnessed the the level of the collective panic that that is like gonna be potentially happen in the near future. We are still in this stage that some people are in denial, and once this collective behavior will emerge, and there are enough percentage of people who are panicking, especially given the fact that there are no coming solid positive news in the following weeks, then um, we're gonna witness very, very nonlinear responses. Every individual makes decisions based on their own circumstances. What the entire system, how the entire system would be affected by this unpredictability, I cannot say that. I can say that the worst case scenario can happen when there are enough percentage of people and individuals who are panicking enough to do some kind of irrational or rational behaviors, I don't know, based on their circumstances, that can impact the entire system as a whole. So how do you prevent that? I don't know. It's still really dependent on the goal that you want to achieve, the problem that you want to frame. Do you really want to just, save your economic system, or do you really want to stick to the moral constraints? I'm not sure. It depends on the system you're talking about. So it's really complicated, but at the same time, it's really interesting to see these patterns of emergent behaviors in this crisis.
Right. Well, so when I listen to people sort of separate the economic issue from the livelihood issue and from the lives issue, I don't think that's necessarily the most sophisticated point of view to hold, because let's just say, for example, I'm the leader of one of the countries. To me, the livelihood of people, their lives, the economy, and the protection of them are all basically one thing. If you separate them, you're going to create a set of concerns that are not going to be, it's going to be intractable. So the way I would look at that is say, okay, look, we have this issue. We have this virus. We don't know how far it's been spread. And right now, the problem is that it's asymmetrically costing us money because we have to lock everybody down because we don't know where this predator is. It's a hidden predator. But if we can get more testing involved, we can see more people who are potentially carrying the virus. We can isolate them. The people who don't have it, we can sort of move them to one part of the system where we can say, okay, here everybody gets tested every morning. We make sure that nobody's showing any symptoms. The people who are infected, they're in a different area just for now, temporarily. Get them, the treatment they deserve, and try to get the economy to sustain itself, because you can't also shut down everything. And the people who advocate for that are throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? So in essence, you don't want to separate the two things. You want to think of them on a parallel track. You have to say, yes, we don't want people dying, obviously. We also don't want the economy to completely collapse, so that when we get out of this, everybody's jobless and we get 25% unemployment. And the last time that happened, we had a guy named Hitler come into power, and we had Stalin come into power, and we had all sorts of, other kind of problems that manifest itself. So we want to try to tackle all these problems all at once. Anybody who takes it on one point of view and just says this is the only thing that matters, everything else is irrelevant, is a person who is essentially confusing their ability to understand uncertainty, because that's what they say. Well, this virus is uncertain. We don't know what it's going to do. we're going to get people murdered, that's fine. But then they come back to you with a very certain solution. Well, the solution is certainly this. And you go, well, yeah, but what about the consequences of that? The consequences of that, you don't even know what that's going to lead to. Well, that's not really the main problem here. I'm like, no, you have to stop and think. We have to be reasonable in all our approaches. The minute we can make this thing visible, we have a better shot at containing it, and we have a better shot at maintaining the livelihood of the country, because people, they don't realize it takes 100 years for a country to become economically stable, to progress towards everybody having a decent job, everybody getting, proper opportunities for their families and their kids. And then within 3 months, you could shut all that off and everything goes back to, 200-300 years ago, and everybody's poor all over again. That's also not a viable solution. So I'm in that camp where I was early to say this is a problem, we need to address it. But I'm also in the early other camp to say, yeah, the drastic measures of just discounting the economy as if it's nothing is also not a good solution, right? So both of those things can create problems. In both cases, you are humble before the uncertainty of what you're dealing with, but you don't want to be absolutely certain in your solution either. The solution can't just be everybody stay home for the next year, right? It just doesn't work. So I think leaders who try to appease a particular crowd, and everybody looks through things through their lens, and the track that you want to approach is to say, how can I look at this from multiple lenses? How can I try to appreciate everybody's point of view and then make a decision on that front? And the reason why that's interesting is because it comes back to you, and I'm going to ask you, how come the Iranian government didn't recognize the problem? And when they did, what have they done so far to contain this problem?
Well, and you were spot on, because I totally agree with your point of view, but in terms of systems engineering aspect, like as a systems engineer, we understand that, okay, you have an environment and you face with a problem, right? And you want to come up with a solution. But the point is, in order to implement your solution, in order to deploy your solution in an appropriate context, an appropriate environment, in order to, tackle the main problem, first of all, you have limited resources, right? And second of all, you need to understand, how do you want to realize this solution? Like, theoretically speaking, they are all, great solutions that we all need to do. Like, for example, testing for everybody, right? But I'm not saying that it's not possible. It's definitely possible, especially for like wealthy and developed countries like the United States, for example. But it's not the case for all the countries in the world. Testing for everybody. You need to consider the restrictions and infrastructure of these countries, the amount of wealth they have, the amount of how serious this crisis has already got in their country. So there are different criteria that you need to take into consideration. And also, when you deploy your solution into the problem in order to meet to address, into the environment in order to address your problem, there is possibility that, it's not even possibility, it's certain that your environment is not going to be the same as your previous environment. You just added something into the environment in order to address the real problem. But what this means is that maybe the solution that you proposed and you deployed is also causing some second order problems in your environment. How do you want to manage that? So exactly when you this is the fact, when you want to, frame your decisions, how do you want to approach to address this problem? These are very, very important questions that you need to ask of course, you don't have all these informations because it's all about uncertainties. It's all about taking risks. But are you taking these risks with an acceptable logic? Are you prepared for the worst case scenario, or are you just relied on the luck? And in terms of the your question, well, I have been out. I mean, I've never been in Iran in the last 5 years, so all these news that I get from Iranian government's actions against the spread of this virus is just based on, firsthand, some of the friends that I have there, they told me something, or my families, they told me something about their actions. But in general, they are not locking down organizations and companies. They were not closing different roads. So I don't know if you know it, but we had a New Year, like the Persian New Year, and it was 2 weeks of holidays. And I heard that so many people went to vacations and the roads were not closed. And when you see this macro pattern of mobility within the boundaries of this country, you're thinking that, okay, to be honest with you, I don't know the logic behind the reactions of Iranian government, and I'm sure that their official data is not accurate, because I personally know at least 5 people who have died from coronavirus.
So to hear that.
Yeah, when I know at least 5 people who died from this coronavirus, it seems to me like a very serious issue. And I've heard that healthcare systems are not, compatible with the amount of patients, coronavirus, especially coronavirus patients. They suggest that you should stay home and don't come to hospitals and emergency rooms unless it is very, very necessary. So they are in the midst of this economic collapse and healthcare collapse, and yet they are not acting appropriately. Well, because of the, in my opinion, it's just my opinion. I'm not saying that this is the real issue, but in my opinion, the government system in Iran is getting to a more kind of a chaotic situation that I no longer can reason through their actions. Like whether they are purposefully doing nothing about this, I don't know. If they are so incompetent to do anything about it, it's completely possible. So it's a very complicated country to study. You cannot rely on their official data either. So it's kind of, I would say that it's kind of a separate use case study. I have no solid answer to your question. So all I can see is that they are not doing it appropriately, but I cannot come up with a good reason and logic for their actions. Is it intentional or not? I am not sure. So yeah.
Well, let me put you in a bit of a hot seat now, because since you're studying systems that are related to scientific inquiry in terms of the rigor that's required. So when I hear somebody claim along those lines, I immediately want to test their ability to make predictions, right? Because for me, This is just my own personal bias. Obviously, it's not applicable to everybody, but for me, a field of science that's actually worthy of deep respect and application in the real world, there has to have some characteristic of predictability to it. So I'm going to put you in the hot spot, and you're welcome to say you don't know, but it is a risky conversation. We get it. It's your opinion. Feel free to just take a shot at it. You don't have to, give the academic answer if I'm not sure. So I'm just going to give you the warning right off the bat. But so let's look at it this way. So you have two systems. You have the United States and you have Iran. We know we have different infrastructures in terms of how they're going to handle the same problem, because both of them have the same problem right now, which is the coronavirus. So if you have two different systems, what is going to be the adaptive emergent behavior that you can predict with some level of confidence in how the United States is going to handle this versus a closed authoritarian state like Iran? So feel free, take a swing. It's all good. Nobody's going to hold you accountable for these words. It's all good. We're just two friends having a conversation. Go for it.
Well, to be honest with you, when you are trying to compare two different systems to each other, you need to understand the differences. I really think that the people in Iran, their behavior is completely different from the people in some first world country like the United States. The people in Iran, like, I don't know if you remember, it was a disaster about that, and airplane, they shot it, I don't know, intentionally or unintentionally, and killed 170 people. So every day, people in Iran facing real crisis, right? It's not a pandemic, but it's regional crisis. It's directly impacting their life. So do they react to a problem like a pandemic, like a COVID-19 pandemic, similar to the way that American people will react? I don't think so. So the emergent behavior of these people is completely different. At the same time, the people in Iran are kind of prepared. I'm not saying prepared, they just accept their fate, kind of. So they are ready for many, much more negative news from this pandemic. But on the other hand, the United States people don't used to these kind of crises. They have had their, easy, quiet, and rather stable life for so long, and then all of a sudden they have to be quarantined. And even though that the impact of this crisis, the objective impact of the crisis to the economic system, to whatever systems you're talking about, like the political systems of these countries, the reaction to these changes in the environment is not the same. Maybe even though the Iranian people have faced with much more serious crisis, they can adapt better. Because they are also, the same thing, the similar thing as anti-fragility that Nassim is promoting. They are, I guess they are more anti-fragile in terms of people, but in terms of the government, it's a totally different story. You are talking about a different scale, a different layer in this system. Whether Iranian government can survive out of this crisis, I really don't know. It's really possible that they won't if this gets more and more severe, and if for example, the news of success in achieving an appropriate vaccine is not coming in the following weeks. So there are different aspects to these problems. So that's why you cannot kind of compare these two countries as a whole. Like you need to, focus your lens. What are you talking about? What kind of specific, aspects you are looking for to predict? In no sense I'm predicting anything. So I cannot. I mean, it's more complicated than for me being able to predict these things. But I would say that there are branches of probabilities, and this probability is not very low, not insignificant. The probability of the government will collapse eventually, because the risk is accumulative, so accumulating over time. And the Iranian government has been taking very, very deadly risks for, I can say, so long. So I don't know if they can, get out of this crisis.
Well, so on that front, I'll give you my take on it. And again, this is just an opinion amongst many opinions. So if it comes true, so be it. If it doesn't, again, so be it. It's 50-50 shot. The way I see it is that in any case, typically an authoritative state tends to be able to survive if it can externalize their cruelty onto their people while shielding themselves from the direct and indirect blowback of it. In this particular case, the cruelty that is being foisted upon the country is not one that is tailored from the state to the people. It's everybody. So I think when all of them get sick and the people start to look at this and say, look, we've been under this terrible regime and this oppressive amount of control, and you guys couldn't even protect us from this, and even your own authority keeps, degrading its value in the sense that what you claim you could do for us is evidently more and more false than it ever was. And I think this is the type of thing that can catalyze the whole structure collapsing in on itself. So I will take that position to say that I think there's a pretty good probability, 51-49, not 90-10, not 99-1. I think 51-49 that the Iranian authoritative state doesn't come out of this intact. I think what may happen is that the people will finally say, look, we've had enough. You guys have been trying it your way, and clearly you're not capable of handling anything because the rest of the world also suffered from this. So it's not like you guys can say that it's not our fault, but at least they were better prepared in the sense that they had more wealth at their disposal to handle at least trying to get us back up on our feet. You guys have squandered years and years of being in power. You haven't done anything economically for us. You haven't done enough economically for yourself. The price of oil is dropped to, it's cheaper to buy a large pizza than it is to buy a barrel of oil now. So I think, given all those factors, that if I was a betting man, and this is an open system, so obviously there's no real way to say it's going to go left or right. And typically in open systems, as I've learned from Nassim, the odds are always 50-50. But in this case, I'm willing to go that extra mile and say 51-49 in favor of the people overthrowing this authoritative government.
I guess that's the best case scenario, unfortunately, because the problem is that the people in Iran are so. I mean, it's not a scientific term, but like we are having a conversation. Are so tired. They don't have energy. Like even though they get to some kind of wealth and pleasure and peace to some extent, they are too tired to just be proactive in overthrowing the government. Plus, when you are dealing with this kind of exhaustion, then emergent behaviors need like some kind of modules try to grow and activate their neighboring modules, and their neighboring modules activate the other modules, and then this emergent behavior arises from bottom up. But what if there are not enough modules that have enough resources and energy and innovation to just grow? So this is one of the like worst case scenarios. In this case, sometimes an outsider stimuli or some kind of changes in their environment might force them to just wake up. But these environment effects are just happening in the boundaries of the system, right? That's exactly the thing that might happen for Iran. And in these kind of crises, you are dealing with a pandemic. So all these countries are involved. It's not like China is not involved or Russia is not involved. Everyone is in the same game. And they are trying their best to just get out of this crisis. So it's not like the government has their usual outside resources that they can, seek for.
Well, so I hear what you're saying, and here's why I'm going to give that extra 51-49 percentage point. It's twofold. One, typically a tyrannical source of a state needs a proxy supporter, sort of like what we would call a patron. So typically you had the Soviet Union that was funding various, Eastern Bloc countries with their puppet dictators taking orders from Moscow. Or you have Kim Jong-un taking orders from Xi Jinping in China. In this particular instance, it's kind of weird. It's asymmetrically set up, and I mean that in the following way. So you got to think of this sort of like if you're playing hockey, right? If you're a goaltender and you need to win, but your team can't score very much, you have to stop every single shot coming in your direction. So the Iranian government is set up in such a way where they have to be perfect so that they can stop something from happening. The reason they have to be perfect is, in this particular instance, and under these circumstances, their usual allies are not in a position to offer them any help. So that's one problem for them. I'm sure China could if they wanted to, but I'm not sure they will in this particular instance because they have their own bigger problems to deal with. But two, the more interesting aspect of it is, if you remember, the Arab Spring actually started out with a young man who lit himself on fire. I believe it started off in Morocco. Correct me if I'm wrong. But it took one person to sort of speak, as you said, to be the catalyst to instantiate the response and the node next to them. And everybody started to just kind of get fed up enough. And then you get the madness of crowds and you get the energy just sort of feeding in and of itself. And the reason I bring that up is that if you study political systems, which is what I was doing before we came onto this conversation with you, because I was trying to bring a different element to help stimulate the conversation on that front, is that political systems are essentially containers for energy flow within the population. So a good container is one where you have release valves in multiple locations. So that's what the United States is sort of set up like, right? So you have the Congress, which cuts the checks. You have the Senate, which usually writes the laws. Then you have the executive branch, and that's where they actually go and make decisions. Then you also have the Supreme Court that makes sure that anything that they do is not unconstitutional. And so at any given day, on any given issue, half the people are divided, and that's what you want, because you want multiple pulls and pushes in various directions. And the best part of it is every 2 to 4 years, they get to change sort of directions. Now, it may not be perfect. We get that, but at least it gives you something. Now, if you contain that system like you do in an authoritative state, i.e. something like what they do in Iran, is it's kind of like putting a pressure cooker. And yeah, you can contain it for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, but eventually it just takes one instance of one person showing an act of civil disobedience, the likes of which can erupt the sympathy and empathy of all their fellow countrymen. And when that happens, if that happens, it's going to happen, just a matter of when, not if, actually. I believe that that's what's going to tilt the conversation from 50-50 of the states surviving versus 51-49 of them not surviving.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree with you. Like, eventually, this is not gonna be the system that can survive in a long run. That's for sure. We have a principle in systems engineering saying that if your system can be failed, it will be failed. It's just a matter of time. But in terms of just immediate prediction of like the near future of Iran, I am skeptical because I think that first of all, this mechanism has not emerged a true leader out of it, and it's possible to win kind of a social movement without a leader, but it's hard, right? Because at some point you need some kind of force to make this synergy to happen. And it's not the case right now, unfortunately. When this leader will emerge from this mechanism, I have no idea. But if it's gonna be the case, eventually, I'm 100% sure about that. If they can survive out of this crisis, it's kind of it's relatively speaking, I can say that okay, probably yes, because I've heard that in their news they are advertising that, oh, look at these first world countries, their stock, their food stock, their like I don't know, paper towel stock is empty, and yet we have all these kind of stuff in our grocery stores. So we are thriving this through this crisis. But the point is they are not factoring the fact that okay, in the first world country, people have actually cash or they have credits. They can use it during crisis. But in Iran, they don't have cash. They don't have like liquid money as much as first world countries do. So these kind of so that's why they might not be able to stock up on foods or some necessary stuff during this crisis. So this is not a good indication of their success against beating this virus. But again, these are advertisements, and these are kind of populist approaches in order to just take control of this situation. So if they're gonna survive, I don't think so. But if they're gonna survive out of this crisis, I'm not sure. It's possible that they don't, but it's still possible that they do. So, yeah.
So just a curious question. Do they have credit cards available in Iran? Because I know they don't in Afghanistan. That's a question I never really thought about until you just mentioned it. Is there credit cards and lines of credit and personal loans and stuff like that set up in the banking countries there, or are those haram and therefore they don't allow it?
Well, as far as I know, I don't. I mean, I'm 5 years like out of this country, so I'm not sure. But during the time that I was there was no such thing as credit card. You had to pay everything with your cash. There were some kinds of loans, and I know that there were some kind of emergence of private banking system, so they gave you a lot of money in terms of loans, but with higher interest rate. But I'm not a good person to say that. I can say that as far as I know, they didn't have credit cards. but it might have changed. I don't know.
Okay, fair enough. So on that front, I mean, it's going to be interesting to watch all this stuff unfurl. And with respect to your time, is there anything else you would like to go over that we didn't have a chance to talk about yet?
No, I mean, if you have any specific question, but not, no.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions from Twitter. So I'll just give them to you, and you can just quickly, respond to them the best you know how. So the first question is, typically a system is, in essence, two mechanisms. One mechanism is the information that flows through the system, and the other mechanism is how that information is processed. So when you look at the systems that you're studying, where do you find the best places to put leverage in? Is it the flow of information, or is it the actual computation of what to do with that information that gives you the most bang for buck?
Combination of both, I would say. We have different types of methodologies in facing with these problems. We have two different concepts: validation and verification. I'm not sure if we already talked about it. I don't remember. But validation is to make sure that, okay, this order of preferences that you come up with in your solution space is actually right. Meaning that this effort that you're making is actually meeting the correct problem. So the flow of information kind of requires this validation process. But in terms of computation and accuracy of this flow of information, it's another subject when you are doing verification. Is the system is structured or is behaving as the way it is supposed to behave in terms of systems designers' a point of view. So these are the things that we need to make sure of. And there are different types of, modeling that we can, use in terms of what kind of questions we want to answer. The first thing is that, everybody knows that real world is different from model world, right? But in terms of answering some specific questions, then if you need to, use appropriate type of model, if you want to, analyze a specific decision-making point or analyze a specific trade-off analysis, you can use a specific model, mathematical model, or if you want to kind of understand one abstract concept in the real world, there's another types of, modeling that allows you to kind of better understand the abstraction of the world and the abstraction of the, information that you need to have for your system. There are other types of models that you use in order to actually use as an analogy of system behavior. How does this work with this level of knowledge, with this level of available information in your system? So there are some techniques to come up with, but both sides are very important. But it depends on the perspective that you look at your problem. If you want to make sure that this solution is the right one to your problem, then the flow of information and the source of this information becomes very important. If you're talking about if the system that I built is the way that I want it to be, then it's matter of computation error, model error, and things like that. So.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. And the next question we had was from one of our younger audience members who was looking to get into your field. what should they really focus on being strong at to succeed in your field? Is it the math? Is it the physics? Is it a combination of both, or is it just something else?
I would say the philosophy, like before people get into systems engineering and system types of world, they need to equip themselves with the philosophy of system science. So it's a branch of system science. So it's system philosophy. Once you understand the philosophy behind this concept, and then you can use like systems theory, the principles you apply to this philosophy in order to, grasp the real world and apply it to your problems. I would say that these are the main prerequisite for being a good systems engineer. And then, yes, math is really important. If you want to be a good systems engineer, you need to understand different mathematical theories like probability theory, set theory, category theory, decision theory. So yeah, math is really helpful in that context. But I would say the first step is understanding the philosophy. It's much more helpful.
Okay, perfect. Well, that wraps up the questions we had from our audience. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your point of view and sharing with us your knowledge and your perspective.
Thank you for having me.
We hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we have. The truth is, any conversation worthy of having will inherently be a risky one.
Thank you for listening. Stay anti-fragile and carry on the ancient tradition and your own unique way of saying what only you can say and doing what only you can do. Abiding by Milton's words, this is Ember Sadat and Ace Deliri signing off, wishing you the very best of worthy and risky conversations.